Walking home from work, I happened to look down and saw a small brass-colored medallion sitting in the gutter. Curiously, I pulled it out and held it up, examining it. When I'd seen it, I'd hoped that it might be worth something, but as I looked at it, I realized that it was only a cheap piece of costume jewelry. Probably for kids or something. I noticed that there was a picture of a little angel on it, and some writing I couldn't make out on the other side. Probably a good luck charm or something, I decided that I'd give it to my niece the next time my brother came over to visit, so I slipped the medallion in my pocket and kept walking home. When I got home, I called, "Honey, I'm home," before remembering that my wife Kim was out of town for the weekend on a business trip. I'd met Kim some 7 years ago when we were both in college. She had been my roomie's girlfriend, and when she'd come to the room to see him, and found him gone and me there, we got to talking. It was very innocent at first, but I quickly fell in love with her, and she with me. A year later, we were married. I loved Kim and thought her attractive, but she certainly wasn't gorgeous. She had mousy brown hair and slightly small breasts. She was fun to be with though, which made up for what she lacked in looks. I have to admit that I'm not really a prize either. My name is Dennis Mitchell. I know, I've heard all the jokes before. I'm 5'11" and have a full head of hair, but I was beginning to get a bit of a spare tire. I wasn't ugly though, just about average. I threw my jacket over a chair and went to the kitchen to nuke myself some leftovers for dinner. I really didn't feel like cooking something when it was just me eating. After eating, I threw the few dirty dishes into the sink, planning on cleaning them a bit later. I figured that since I was living alone for a few days, I might as well play Bachelor a bit while I still could. Sitting down on the couch, I started paging through the TV guide, looking to see if anything was on, but then I remembered that I'd put my last pair of clean underwear on that morning, and I didn't have any more clean undies in my drawer. I groaned, knowing that this meant laundry. Reluctantly, I got up and threw the laundry into the washing machine, deciding to just get the white clothes for now, since that was all I really needed. Then I went back to the boob tube, remembering that X-Files was going to be on a bit later. I never was a real big fan of the show. I mean, it's pretty far-fetched and all, but it was somewhat entertaining anyway, so I tended to put it on when nothing better was on. I looked at my watch, wanting to see how much time I had left till it came on, and resigned myself to 20 minutes of mindless channel changing. A bit later, after the show had started, I heard the washing machine turn off, but waited till the commercial to change the load to the dryer. After getting the dryer going, I went to the kitchen to grab myself a beer, and settled back down on the couch, making myself comfortable. I lit myself a cigarette and sat back to enjoy the show. I used to smoke a bit more, but in the last 6 months had cut myself down to 3 smokes a day. I mean, everyone has to have at least one bad habit. During the next commercial, I remembered the medallion I'd found earlier, and wanted to take a closer look at it. Pulling it out, I saw that it didn't look any more impressive now than it had earlier, but I did notice it was fairly dirty. Sitting back down, I held it in front of me by the chain, and span it around. I kept thinking that my niece Melissa might like it. I think I fiddled with it off and on for the rest of the show, but wasn't really paying it any attention. I was still rolling it around in my hands when the dryer alarm went off. Putting the medallion around my neck, I went to go pull the load out. I threw it all in the laundry basket, figuring that I'd fold it and put it away later. Kim always folded it when it was fresh out of the dryer, but she wasn't around, and I didn't feel like folding the clothes just now. Looking down, I remembered that the medallion was a bit dirty and smudged, so I decided to wipe it off a bit. I pulled open the clothes hamper and pulled one of the dirty shirts out of it to clean the thing with. I mean, the shirt was already dirty, so getting it a bit dirtier wasn't a big deal. Offhandedly, I noticed that it was one of Kim's blouses. I started rubbing the medallion with her blouse, and felt an odd tingle that I figured must have been a small static shock. I put the blouse back in the dirty hamper, and walked into the living room again, looking at the medallion now that it was a bit cleaner. I had to admit, it did look a little better, but it still wasn't worth much. Tossing the medallion on the coffee table, I bent over to pick up the TV guide again. That's when I noticed that my pants felt a little loose around the waist. I pulled them a little and found a bit of give. I guessed I must have lost a little weight without even realizing it. I smiled, thinking that Kim would approve. I sat back down on the couch again, taking drink from my beer and watching another car commercial. I shook my foot, realizing that my shoes felt loose. That was definitely odd. Standing up, I felt my foot slide inside a little bit and was sure that my shoe was loose. I remembered that it had been just as snug as usual earlier on, and I would have noticed if my shoes were loose. I walked to the kitchen, feeling somewhat odd, but I couldn't place exactly what it was that wasn't normal. I felt my pants shift again, and noticed that I had a bit more give than I did just a few minutes earlier. That definitely wasn't right. This was beginning to remind me of something that should be on X-Files. I rubbed at a slight itch on my jaw, and felt a bit of a scratching. Pulling my hand back quickly, I looked at my fingers, and saw that my fingernails were all a little bit longer. I began to worry, and realized that my hands seemed smaller, which made me worry more. I hurried to the bathroom and stared in the mirror, being surprised by what I saw. I didn't look right. It was still my face, but it looked somehow a little softer. I realized that I couldn't see my accustomed 5 o'clock shadow. I rubbed my cheek and it felt smooth. Still looking in the mirror, I noticed other things wrong, all at once. For one thing, my hair was a bit longer, and I seemed to look a little smaller. I realized that all my clothes were a bit loose on me. What the hell? I said aloud, and heard my voice cracking a bit. I stared at my face, and could almost swear that I was watching it slowly change before my eyes. My hair noticeably grew longer, and was a slightly different shade of brown. I saw that my eyes had changed from their normal grayish blue to brown. Holding my hands up to my face, I saw that they were a bit smaller still, and again the nails were a little longer. Almost feminine. I looked again in the mirror and saw the reflection looking back at me, definitely showing feminine traits. In a panic, I ran my hands over my body, feeling my chest and realizing in horror that my nipples were at least twice the size as before, and that slight breasts were pushing out into my hands. I hesitated for a second, afraid of what I'd find, then put my hand down my pants, and was pleased that I still had my equipment, and it didn't seem much changed. Looking in the mirror, the face I saw began to look familiar. I realized that I was looking a bit like Kim. I stared at myself for several more minutes, and became positive that I was changing into Kim somehow. I kept my hands on my budding breasts, and could feel them noticeably swelling under my hands. I felt myself shrinking a bit, and pulled my shoes off completely before I tripped over them. Then for good measure, I pulled off my pants since the legs were way too long for me now. Several minutes later, I realized that I looked exactly like Kim, except that my equipment was still downstairs. I realized, though, that it did seem smaller, and watched with horror as it slowly shrank. I held on to it the entire time, hoping somehow that I could keep it from happening. After my equipment shrank, my testicles pulled in, and sort of disappeared inside of me. The rest just kept shrinking and changing, and I watched with a shocked fascination as my groin went flat, then a slit developed. I looked in the mirror and Kim's face looked back at me. I smiled, and saw Kim smile. I examined my body completely, and could find no trace that this wasn't Kim's body. I even had the scar Kim had on her knee, and the butterfly tattoo on her ankle. Horrified, I tried to think what could have caused this, and told myself to stop that. I made myself calm down, and sat on the couch, trying to keep this situation from overwhelming me. I looked down, seeing the medallion, and realizing that this started as soon as I put it on. Somehow, that thing had turned me into Kim. It stood to reason that it could turn me back again as well. I picked up the medallion and said, "I wish to be me again," not being surprised to hear Kim's voice. I waited several minutes but was disappointed to see that nothing happened. I tried wording the wishes and commands differently, but nothing happened. I put the medallion on and tried it, and again nothing. Calmly, I forced myself to remember everything I'd done since I found the thing, and the only thing I could think of was that I'd touched it to Kim's blouse when I'd been wearing it. It did make a strange sort of sense. I put it back on and held my own shirt to it. After several minutes, I was forced to admit that it didn't work and threw it angrily in a corner. I think I cried for a little while after this, but I think anyone would with something like this happening. I did still have hope though that it would wear off. After a while, I got myself under control again and lit myself another cigarette. My fourth for that day, but I figured that with the day I'd had, I could certainly use one. It didn't taste quite right, and it seemed a bit harsher on my throat and lungs than usual. I wondered if that was because Kim didn't smoke. It didn't matter though, and I kept smoking it. When I was through, I got up, trying the medallion one more time, praying it would work. I felt a familiar pressure on my bladder, and reluctantly went to the bathroom to relieve myself. I'd been pretty reluctant to check out my new body completely, but was surprised that when I sat on the toilet and peed, it felt sort of normal. I mean, it came out of the wrong spot, and sprayed out a bit instead of coming in the stream I was used to, but for some reason, it didn't really feel that odd to pee that way. When I was done, I wiped myself down, and my hands seemed to know just how, and where to wipe. I went to bed early, hoping this would all be a bad dream, and would end when I woke up. I'd had a hard time getting comfortable and getting to sleep. When I tried to sleep on my stomach, as I often did, the breasts were very noticeable. I wondered how women with big breasts could ever get to sleep. Eventually though I did get to sleep. When I wake up, I was thinking what an odd dream I'd had. I didn't really feel very odd, almost normal actually. I went to scratch at my chest, and was surprised to feel a breast at my fingertips, rather than the usual hair. This woke me immediately. Reluctantly I put Kim's robe on, knowing that none of my own clothes would fit me, and I didn't really want to dress in anything of hers until I had to. Hesitantly, I went about my usual Saturday morning routine. I put coffee on, and waited for the pot to fill. I stuck my hand out the front door, and brought in the morning paper, and sat reading it until the coffee pot finished filling. I sat quietly, reading the paper and drinking my coffee, then lit myself a cigarette as I usually did. I didn't really feel any need for it, but it was my morning habit. Again, it was rather rough on my throat and lungs, and left a sort of bad taste in my mouth, which the coffee covered up rather well. I put it out half finished this time, not getting the satisfaction from it that I usually got. I wondered what Kim was doing right then, hoping that I'd get back to normal and that she'd never find out about this. I'd never hear the end of it if she did. Without much hope of success, I pulled the medallion out of the corner where I'd thrown it, and put it around my neck. "Here goes everything," I muttered, holding my shirt to it. I felt the tingle. I smiled. "Yes," I said. It worked. I watched in anticipation and joy as my usually hairy arms returned, and I slowly changed by to myself. There must be some sort of time limit on it, I realized. That's what kept me from changing back right away. Reluctantly, I tried it again, using one of Kim's shirts. I didn't really want to change again, but I just had to know if I was right. I was relieved when nothing happened. Encouraged by this, I became sure that I was right, and determined to find out how long that time limit was. I started to test it again every half hour, confident that I could always change back, and that it wasn't permanent. Again and again I tested it, with no changes. Then, 12 hours after I'd finally changed back, I felt the tingle again, and watched as I slowly started to change. Knowing what was happening to me this time, and knowing it was only temporary, made me much more confident. I watched with amazement and excitement as I slowly changed. I examined every bit of my body, watching for the signs of the changing, and feeling myself as I changed. Within half an hour, I stood as an exact copy of Kim again. I stared at myself in the mirror, in awe. It was hard to believe that this image was me. I ran into the bedroom, and started digging through Kim's clothes. I put on a pair of her jeans, and one of her bras. I was amazed that I put it on with ease, though I'd never worn, or even thought of wearing a bra before in my life. Kim, and now I could have done without a bra, but I didn't feel right getting dressed without one for some reason. I finished putting on one of her t-shirts, and a pair of tennis shoes she had in the closet. I admired myself in the mirror, seeing her as she usually looked. I did notice something wrong though, and went and brushed my hair and put on a little bit of makeup. My instincts seemed to guide me somehow, and I didn't have any problems. Finally, I decided that I was ready to go out. It was already fairly late in the evening, but I just had to get out of the house, so I decided to head over to the AM/PM. It was still open. The drive over was rather odd for me, and I had to move the seat of my car way up and adjust the mirrors. I walked into the store, suddenly afraid that the people in it would see through my disguise. No one looked at me as if anything was out of the ordinary though, so I walked down the aisles, picking up a few things I wanted to get anyway, then went to the cashier in front. The pimply teenager rang up my purchase then said, "Thank you for coming, ma'am. Please shop here again." I walked out, feeling energetic and excited from my being able to walk in public as Kim, and not attract any odd notice. I went directly back to our home, not wanting to push my luck too far. I caught myself speeding and had to slow down, not wanting to be pulled over and found without a license. Kim had hers with her. At the house, I ran in, feeling glorious. I felt so excited by what this medallion meant. I'd never wanted to be a woman, and didn't plan on becoming one again after I changed back, but the experience so far was definitely interesting. I had other plans for the medallion. However, I decided that while I was a woman, I might as well enjoy and take advantage of it. I stripped off Kim's clothes and studied myself in front of the mirror. It wasn't any better looking than usual, but it was a different way to look at it. I did look pretty cute though, I thought. I started rubbing my breasts, enjoying the feel of them and the strange sensitivity they had. I felt myself start to get aroused, and moved one hand between my legs and started rubbing there. I felt the moisture on my fingertips, and carefully inserted one finger into my new vagina, not wanting to hurt myself with my fingernail. Fortunately, Kim never kept her nails very long, which made this a bit easier. It felt odd having the finger inside of me, but erotic too at the same time. I moved it around, and groaned in pleasure. I tensed my vaginal muscles, and felt my finger get squeezed a little. Laying down on the bed, I kept rubbing myself, feeling the sexual tension grow, till finally I orgasmed. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, enjoying the afterglow that I'd heard about, but never felt until now. The orgasm felt much like mine usually did, but a bit more spread out, rather than focused all in one place. Careful, I told myself. You might start to like this. Then I got up and showered. I was careful not to get myself excited again, then went back to the living room to enjoy a beer while I thought about what I was going to do with the medallion. That night I slept much better, and in the morning I cheerfully went about my morning routine, minus the cigarette, then dressed up in one of Kim's outfits and went out to mall. I went into a clothing store and tried on several dresses, planning on getting Kim a surprise when she got back. I wanted to make sure that it would fit her, and this was the perfect way to make sure. Afterwards, I returned home with the dress, and looked at the image of Kim in my mirror for the last time, and almost reluctantly, put the medallion back on, and changed by to myself. I had to admit, it was kind of fun being someone else when you know it's only for a short while, though I certainly wouldn't want to stay that way. I was happy just being myself. I knew that Kim would be home early the next morning, and I had a few things that I wanted to do before she got back. When Kim got home, I didn't tell her anything about what happened. The next Friday night, I surprised Kim with the dress, and impressed her that it fit perfectly. We went out for dinner and dancing, which we hadn't done in a while, and then had a somewhat less than spectacular lovemaking session before falling asleep. After I was sure that Kim was asleep, I was sure to wait a bit longer, then I cautiously got out of bed, and quietly pulled the medallion out of where I'd hidden it in the closet. At the same time, I pulled out a hair scrunchie that I'd hidden with it. The scrunchie belonged to a woman that worked in my office, that I'd always been very attracted to. A gorgeous, long-legged blonde with ample cleavage. I'd had dreams about her, though I would never tell Kim that. Though I was attracted to this woman, I loved Kim to ever cheat on her, and this stolen scrunchie, and the medallion gave me a way to have both. Careful not to disturb or wake her, I placed the medallion around Kim's neck, then touched the scrunchie to it. I watched for a few seconds in the faint light, to see if I could notice any changes yet. Again, careful not to disturb her, I removed the medallion, and hid it and the scrunchie in a corner of the closet. Then I cautiously crawled back into bed, with a smile on my face. The next morning, I woke up, to see Kim staring at herself in the mirror, with a look of absolute shock on her face, and with a bit of both fear and joy at the same time, I think. I pretended shock and surprise and asked, "Who are you? What are you doing in my house? And where's my wife?" Kim tearfully tried to claim she was my wife, and I pretended not to believe her. Slowly though, I let her convince me that she was who she claimed to be. I pretended to be sympathetic, worried and very confused about how she could have changed overnight, and then started to point out how much a blessing it could be. It didn't take long for her to agree with me, and get excited about her gorgeous new body. Having gone from average to model gorgeous was a shock to her, but she quickly came to like it. That afternoon, I took her out shopping, and then out to dinner and dancing again. She was the center of attention, receiving looks of lust and jealousy, while many men looked at me in envy. The next week we went out several times, and she couldn't get enough of the admiring stares, though I was getting a little jealous, I had to admit. Here she was, incredibly gorgeous, and I still looked like I always did. It didn't seem to bother her though. Unfortunately, I received a call from her boss, threatening to fire her if she didn't show up for work. She'd called in sick, unable to think of a way to convince her boss that she was Kim Mitchell. Reluctantly I explained what I'd done, and demonstrated by turning myself into a copy of a man I'd seen her ogling a few nights earlier, and whose jacket I'd borrowed. At first she was furious, and yelled at me, then she started crying. I started crying too. I told her I loved her, and wanted her to be happy, and that she could change back to her old body so she wouldn't lose her job, and I wouldn't mind. She calmed down, losing her anger, and we hugged. My newer, more muscular and handsome body obviously had her staring at me, and she began to realize why I did what I did, and forgave me. That night was great. I slowly pulled down her dress and carried her to the bedroom, finding her weight almost nothing to my new muscles. I pulled off my now extremely tight pants, and was amazed to see how much larger my new body's equipment was than mine. Kim looked at it in obvious lust, and we went to work in a way neither of us had done before. That new body of mine was able to keep going longer than I'd ever gone before. We went at it most of the night, both of us enjoying our and each other's new forms. The next morning, Kim reluctantly changed back to her old form. I watched sadly as her great curves straightened out some, and her glorious long blonde hair turned back to her usual mousy brown. She looked at herself in the mirror when she'd finished changing, and made a face. "I don't really feel comfortable like this anymore," she told me. She dressed up in her regular clothes, and looked longingly at the ones she'd worn only an hour before, but could no longer fit into. Then she went to work. I changed myself back as well, sad to lose all those nice muscles. I felt fat and weak in comparison once I was back to myself. When I got home from work, I gave my traditional, "Honey, I'm home," and came in, setting my jacket on the peg by the door. Walking into the kitchen, I was surprised to see Kim, wearing her nice white silk robe, standing next to the kitchen table, lighting candles. This immediately caught my attention. She smiled at me. "I've got a surprise for you," she said in her sexiest voice, though it wasn't nearly as nice as the ones she'd used the day before. Then she held up the medallion and slipped it over her head. "I see no reason why we can't keep using it, but change back in time to go to work," she told me, then she touched something to the medallion. I watched in awe as her brown hair started to turn red and grow out. Her breasts grew larger and more obvious. Slowly she changed into another gorgeous woman. When she was done, she ran up and kissed me deeply, leaving me ready to come in my pants. "I thought you'd like this form," she said, as she spun around, letting me get a good look at her new shape. I couldn't wait to get her out of the robe. Then she ceremoniously dropped the medallion around my neck, and I didn't think to object as she touched another piece of cloth to it. Immediately I felt myself begin to change. I looked down, watching my muscles beginning to firm up and grow again. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize my face, but I sported a distinguished-looking mustache. That night again, we both enjoyed ourselves immensely, finding that her new body appeared to have an overly developed hormone level and nymphomaniac tendencies. Afterwards, she told me that she borrowed a jacket from a woman that she sometimes worked with, who had a bit of a reputation. We started to change several times a week, right after we both got home from work, and reluctantly changing back again before going to work, with the exception of the weekends, where we stayed in our new forms as long as possible. We kept trying on different forms, taking turns choosing people we'd like each other to become. We started to hit several thrift stores, looking for clothes that looked likely, and for people that we could borrow a hat or a scarf from. One night Kim was a fiery redhead, the next a buxom blonde, then the next she'd be more athletic and wiry. She spent one time as a tattooed biker woman, and another as a petite oriental girl. I myself went through similar changes, going one night as a bodybuilder and another as a more suave appearance. Oftentimes though, she had me stay as myself, while she alone changed, though certainly not always. She preferred me changing into the first other man I'd changed into for her, since that form seemed to have the best endurance and size. Then one Friday night, Kim came up to me as she often did, ready for another night of excitement. "I have something slightly different in mind this time," she said, putting the medallion around her neck and touching a red blouse to it. I didn't see what was so different, except when she put the medallion around my neck, she touched the same blouse to it. We both changed, looking more and more alike. Once again I grew a pair of breasts and became a woman. When we were done, we looked at each other, and saw that we were perfect twins. We both had long dark brown hair, and attractive faces and bodies, without being voluptuous or oversexed. She insisted that we were to go out together, as twins. I reluctantly agreed, and got dressed. As before when I had been a woman, I found that I instinctively knew how to put on the makeup and clothes. When we were done, we decided that I had better call myself Denise for the night. It wasn't as bad as I'd feared, and Kim took it easy on me. We went to a bar, and she made me dance with some guy, who was actually very nice and polite. Lots of men kept flirting with me and Kim, and I felt a bit jealous when they looked at her. Oddly enough, I found myself enjoying some of the attention when it was paid to me, though I found this rather at odds with my male ego. When the night was done, we returned home, with nothing much happening. I think Kim just wanted to spend a night on the town with a girlfriend for a change. I tried to get her interested in a lesbian session, but she wasn't interested at all in that, and we went to sleep with nothing happening. The next day, she wouldn't let me change back yet, and had me go out shopping with her. She kept me like that the whole weekend, seeming to want me to experience much of life as a woman. Some of it I found rather interesting, and I kind of enjoyed admiring gazes, but then I'd get annoyed when men would stare at my breasts when talking to me. I hadn't had that problem when I was Kim, but then again, I didn't look quite as good. Overall, I think this experience brought me and Kim closer together, strengthening our friendship and trust. I understood her a bit better, but was definitely glad to get out of those high heels Monday morning. By then, they'd gotten too easy to walk in for my taste. We didn't use the medallion for the rest of the week, both being too busy at work and spending too many long hours. By Friday, we were both too tired to do anything, and that we had picnic arrangements that weekend with a few friends of ours. I definitely wasn't looking forward to the week, and more hassle at work. I woke up Monday morning, feeling very refreshed, and turned over, seeing that I'd overslept. I must have forgot to turn my alarm on, but then I clearly remembered doing it the night before. Turning over, I saw that Kim had already gone to work. Why didn't she wake me when she left? Then I sat up, and got a rude surprise. My feet weren't anywhere near the end of the bed like they usually were. Staring at my hands, I realized that they were the hands of a child. I got a real bad feeling about this. I hopped out of bed and ran to the bathroom, but couldn't see up high enough to look in the mirror. I only stood as tall as the sink. I'd forgotten all about the full-length mirror in the bedroom in my haste, but remembered it and went back, staring at what I saw in front of me. There was a cute little girl staring back from the mirror. I couldn't be any older than 8 years old. There must be some explanation, I thought. Somehow, the medallion changed me again. That much was obvious. Since I'd changed so many times before, this didn't really bother me too much, and I quickly realized that Kim must have done this to us some sort of joke. Some joke. I can't get to work. I tried looking for the medallion for a few minutes, but immediately found that it wasn't where I'd put it, and I couldn't find it anywhere else. Obviously Kim had hidden it from me. Looking out the door, I saw that my car was gone from the driveway. Kim must have taken it to work. Going back to the bedroom, I found some little girl clothes folded up and sitting on the chair. Getting the hint, I put them on. A few minutes later, I stood there, dressed in a cute little pair of pink coveralls, with bunny rabbits on the front. I wore a white shirt, and put on a small pair of shoes as well. It took me a few tries to get my shoes tied, not being used to these new small fingers. I ran back into the living room, amazed by how much energy I had. I felt wide awake and sort of wired. I decided that I wasn't going to let this get to me, and was going to do my normal morning routine. But when I got to the kitchen, I couldn't reach the coffee pot. I moved a chair over to the counter, and stood on it to get at the coffee. The pot seemed very heavy to me, but fortunately it was only a quarter full, so I could still manage to pour it into the cup. I smelled the coffee, and found that it smelled gross. I tried sipping it, and spit it immediately back out. It didn't taste any better. Sighing, I poured the cup into the sink. I was going to light myself a cigarette, but as I held the cigarette in my hand, fumbling with the lighter, I stopped and looked at it, and for some reason bought icky I put it back in the pack unlit, realizing that this little girl's body was affecting how I was reacting to things. It seemed to be a little stronger than when I was an older woman. Grabbing the newspaper, I did start to read that. I saw that nothing interesting seemed to have been happening, and started paging through it. I saw an article about the latest thing against Clinton, and started to read. A few of the words were hard for me to work out, so I started flipping through the paper again, until the comic section caught my eye. The comics were usually about the last part one read each morning, but for some reason, they seemed to be the only part that looked interesting. When I was done with this, I went and put the TV on, turning on CNN, which I didn't find much better. The reporter was so boring, and I had a hard time keeping myself sitting still. I wanted to move around, and was getting a bit antsy. I started flipping through channels, until I saw one with cartoons. I stopped flipping and sat staring at the cartoon, almost entranced with the bright colors and wild action. I watched the cartoons for almost another hour. When no more were on, then I started roaming the house, looking for things to do. I started working at a few small projects that I'd been wanting to do for a while, but I couldn't really get myself involved, and my attention kept drifting. I think I left a few small messes around the house, not bothering to clean up after myself. It was very odd for me, looking up and seeing everything around me so huge, and I kept being reminded of this fact every time I tried to do anything. When I sat on the toilet to go potty, my feet dangled a few inches above the floor, and I almost felt like I was going to fall in several times. Not a comfortable feeling. Around lunchtime, I was beginning to get hungry, so ran to the kitchen. I'd been running everywhere since I woke up, and started digging through the fridge and cupboards for something to eat. I found some chocolate bars in one of the cupboards that I'd almost forgotten I had. They looked very good, and I found myself eating several of them. I filled myself up on the chocolate, then felt a bit guilty about it afterwards, thinking how childish I was behaving. I reminded myself to keep acting like an adult, and tried not to let the childish aspects take over. Then a little after lunch, I heard the door opening up. Running towards the door, I was determined to confront Kim angrily. I burst in and stopped in surprise, looking way up, and seeing my own face. "Hi cutie," I heard in my own voice. "Kim?" I asked hesitantly. "Who else, silly?" she said, smiling down at me with my own smile. I felt so tiny and helpless as I looked up at this giant. I noticed that she was wearing one of my suits as well, and was carrying my briefcase. She put the briefcase off to the side, and hung up my jacket, then walked past me, ignoring me, to our bedroom. I tried to keep myself patient and waited a little for her to come back out. In a few minutes she did, dressed in more casual clothes of mine. "Why did you do this?" I demanded of her. She smiled again, saying, "You needed a vacation and weren't about to take one, so I went to work for you and asked for the week off." I groaned. How could she do this to me? "It's just you and me for today, sweetheart," she said, bending over and kissing my forehead. This made me feel like some sort of toy. Since the time limit wasn't up yet, I couldn't change back and was at Kim's mercy. She didn't have any. She insisted that we go out to the park, and once there, she insisted that I go and play with the other children on the playground. I felt humiliated, but complied, wanting to get this over with so that I could get back to normal. Oddly enough, I found myself getting caught up in the game of tag that the other children were playing and having a great time. I didn't realize how much time I'd spent running around the playground when finally Kim pulled me away and said it was time to go. She stopped the car and we went to McDonald's for dinner. She ordered me a Happy Meal, which I thankfully ate, being very hungry by this time. Funny how much better the grease burger tasted this time, now that I was a kid. Then we stopped for ice cream. I was really beginning to enjoy this, almost forgetting that I wasn't really a little girl. Finally we got home, and Kim put the medallion around her neck, then touched something to it. She started to become more feminine looking, and her hair started growing longer. I realized that she wasn't turning back into her normal self. After a while, a very nice-looking woman stood there, with long reddish-brown hair, which Kim tied back into a ponytail. I noticed that she had very nice-sized breasts. Not DDs or an incredibly voluptuous body or anything, but still an extremely pretty body. After changing into new clothes, Kim finally put the medallion around my neck and touched something to it. I felt the familiar tingle, and waited eagerly to start growing. That's when I noticed the doorknob was getting higher. I looked down at myself in horror, seeing that I was shrinking again. I watched myself get smaller, with an almost dreadful curiosity, wondering what Kim was up to. Fortunately, I had removed my clothes before trying to change, or I'd be drowning in my clothes. Looking down, I saw that my equipment wasn't coming back. That meant I was still going to be a girl. In fear, I watched this already large woman in front of me seem to get bigger as I shrunk. She was a regular giant compared to me. Then I felt my legs go out from under me, and I fell on my butt, unable to stand up anymore. A few minutes later, I couldn't even sit up, and fell backwards onto my back. Finally, I felt the changes stop. Looking up, everything was slightly blurry. Kim leaned down, looking at me closely, with that gigantic face, and smiled. I hesitantly smiled back, saying that I was all right. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. "Isn't that so cute?" she said, tickling my chin, which made me laugh a little, despite not wanting to. Picking me up, she held me close, which comforted me greatly for some reason. She held me in front of a mirror, letting me get a good look at myself. I was a baby. "That's my baby girl," she said to me in a cutesy voice. "I'm sorry for doing this to you, Dennis," she said to me, still in that annoying cutesy voice that one would use to speak to a baby. I've been thinking about trying to have a baby, but wanted to know what really having a baby would be like first, and I knew that you'd never agree. She tickled my feet, then carried me to the table where she sat me on a blanket and started to put a diaper on me. She must have planned this rather well. It felt humiliating to be wearing a diaper, but when several minutes later I wet myself, I saw how smart she was to put one on. I couldn't help myself, it just came spurting out. I started crying, again, unable to stop myself. She changed my diaper and held me close to her, which felt extremely comforting, and I stopped crying. "I'll change you back at the end of the week," she told me. At work, I was processing the paperwork about this woman and baby that died in a car crash, and I got to thinking what it would be like to be a mommy. I kept the paperwork, and even have her driver's license and the birth certificate, she said, holding both items up for me to inspect. "I'll finish processing their paperwork for the insurance when we change back, but I figure that we can use these until we do. I don't want to be caught driving without a license." Oddly enough, this didn't really attract my attention. I started to feel hungry and cried. "Oh, poor baby's hungry," Kim said down to me. Then she pulled open her shirt and her bra, exposing her breast. For some reason it looked extremely good to me. She held me up to her and put her nipple in my mouth. Instinctively I started sucking and felt tasty warm milk start to fill my mouth and belly. So that was why her breasts were so large. She was nursing. This feeding felt so good, and not only filled my belly, but seemed to fill my whole body with calmness and trust. So this is what a baby feels for their mother. I felt such a trust for Kim, knowing that she'd protect me and take care of me. Afterwards, I felt really tired and went to sleep, curled in Kim's arms. Things started to blur for me, and things weren't very clear. I started to have a much harder time understanding what Kim was saying and could only feel the tone of voice she was using. I couldn't tell how long this was since time ceased to have much meaning to me. I only knew if I was hungry, sleepy, or unhappy. I wasn't able to understand things anymore, seeing the world through a baby's eyes. I knew that my mommy would take care of all my needs. I found out later that this was only for 3 days, but it was more than enough to chase my adult mind away, leaving only a baby behind. I'm sure that if I'd remained like this for any longer, I never would have been able to regain my adult senses when I changed back. I saw mommy standing over me, with a shiny metal thing around her neck, spinning it around, and holding it over me, playing with me. I didn't remember that this was the medallion or what it meant. I couldn't understand what her words meant when she said, "You know what this is. I like having a baby, and think we should have one. I'll change you back tomorrow, and we can work on that," she said to me in that cutesy voice, with look of satisfaction in her eyes. She seemed to greatly enjoy motherhood. I didn't know what she said. It was just nonsense to me. My eyes were on the shiny thing spinning in front of me. I batted at it a little with my baby's hands, and suddenly felt a tingle as I finally caught it. I noticed that mommy had a look of surprise on her face, and of fear, and that scared me, making me cry. I felt myself growing, and saw that mommy, I mean Kim, was shrinking. I started to remember who I was, and regain my senses, but I was a bit confused and dazed, with my adult mind trying to make sense of my infant's perceptions. Finally, I regained control of myself and stood up, finding myself naked, with a diaper split open on the ground under me. I looked over at Kim, seeing her looking up in horror, as she looked about 4 years old, and was still visibly getting younger, with her greatly oversized clothes draped all over her. Getting hold of myself, I pulled her free from the oversized clothes, and held her as she kept shrinking. I was paying more attention to her changing than my own, barely noticing the breasts swelling on my chest, and filling with milk. In her confused state, and now infantile instincts, Kim responded by starting to cry. It stabbed through my heart, hearing her cry, and I held her closely to me, saying, "It's all right. It's all right," trying to comfort her. She seemed so fragile and delicate in my hands, that for a second I was almost afraid that I'd break her, but I knew she needed protecting, and felt a need to take care of her. She calmed down, and started giggling, beginning to find our change of positions funny. I knew that her mind was beginning to cloud over already, from personal experience, and that it wouldn't be long before she was completely absorbed into her infant life. I knew that I had to change us back as soon as the time limit wore off. But until then, I was the one who had to take care of her. She looked at my now swelled breast longingly, and I instinctively held her up to my right breast, and let her get the nipple in her mouth. She started sucking, and I felt the milk flowing out of my nipple. It felt so erotic, and nice. I felt a strong urge to protect this delicate little baby, and held her tightly to me, letting her drink. So this is maternal instinct, I mused to myself. It felt good. After dressing myself up in some of the clothes Kim bought for this body, I dressed her up in an adorable little yellow nightie, and went for a walk in the park. I felt so proud of this little one I was looking out for, and so protective. We were gone for several hours before I decided to return to the house. The time limit had finally worn off, and 12 hours had passed since I became Kim's mommy, and I wanted to change us back as soon as possible. I knew that this time I'd miss being a woman. I'd miss being a mommy and breastfeeding her, and for some reason, this didn't really bother me. I knew I'd regret it, but I didn't want Kim to become stuck in the role of infant. Maybe, I told myself, we can have our own baby, and Kim will let me become her afterwards, for short periods. I laughed, becoming sure of it since it would let us share in feeding times during the night. I laid Kim down on the couch, then went to the dining room table, where I'd left the medallion. I stopped, staring at the table. The medallion wasn't there. I was sure that was where I'd left it. In a near panic, I looked under the table, and on all the chairs. I started to tear apart the house, looking for it, and not finding a clue to where it was. We must have been robbed, I realized in horror, then remembered that the VCR and TV were still there. Nothing of any value was taken, and nothing but the medallion seemed to be missing. And it only looked like cheap costume jewelry. I couldn't understand where it had gone. Kim picked up on my frantic state, and not knowing what was happening, started crying. Immediately I rushed over to her, and held her close to me, calming her down and comforting her. As she calmed down, I felt tears coming down my own cheeks. Not for my own fate, but for Kim's. I knew that she wouldn't remember her old life, probably ever, and would have to go through her childhood all over again. In a way, it was sort of like having her die on me. I was going to miss the old Kim, but I was comforted by the realization that I may have lost a wife and friend, but I'd gained a daughter. I remembered that a bit of what Kim had said to me when I had been the baby. Mostly that the people that we looked like were dead. I went over to the package of papers she'd shown me, already making plans to withdraw all of our money from our account, which ought to hold us up until I managed to get us settled into a new life. Then I opened the papers, curious to see the new name of myself and of my new daughter. I saw the names and smiled. I could live with that. Time to start our new lives. By the way, let me introduce myself. My name is Kimberly Perkins.